Well, good morning. I'm Jeff Edmonds, a senior research scientist in the Russia Studies program at CNA. On behalf of our president and CEO, Catherine McGrady, we'd like to welcome you to this virtual national security seminar event. Before we begin, a few administrative notes. Today's events are on the record. Recording will be available on our site, and we'll follow up with a link if you would like to share that with any colleagues that couldn't join us today. After a brief introduction from me, we'll hear from each of our panelists, followed by a few questions from me, and then we'll open up to your questions. And we do encourage you to send questions. If you're participating through Zoom, please send a question through the Q&A feature. If you're calling in, you can send a message to CNA_NSS@cna.org, which is the same email address that was sent to you in the dial-in information for today's event. So, brief overview of CNA. If this is your first acquaintance with CNA, we're a nonprofit research organization comprised of the Center for Naval Analyses and the Institute for Public Research. The Center for Naval Analyses is the federally funded research and development center for the United States Navy and Marine Corps, but we also support decision makers across the Department of Defense and other U.S. government agencies as well. Our Institute for Public Research supports homeland security and infrastructure protection, public safety, public health, preparedness and response, and emergency operations at all levels of government. So about the NSS, the National Security Seminar Series is a CNA initiative to bring together thought leaders from across the U.S. government, academic and research institutions, the private sector, and U.S. partner nations to share their experience, facilitate discussions, and contribute to an ongoing dialogue about issues affecting national security. Our theme for this year's series is mobilizing cooperation to advance national security. Competition has been the defining paradigm shaping U.S. national security in recent years. But cooperation, both international and domestic, has become increasingly critical to meeting the national security challenges. Effective cooperation across the interagency and between private and public sectors will be needed to safeguard homeland security and to enhance the resilience of our networks and infrastructure to a range of threats. As the Department of Defense implements integrated deterrence, it will need to work with other departments to integrate the instruments of U.S. national power and coordinate between the armed services, combatant commands, allies, and partners to deter adversaries across theaters and the spectrum of conflict. In 2022, the National Security Seminar Series has focused on difficulties of and opportunities for cooperation in the face of enduring challenges, such as climate change and deterrence, and emerging threats like new technologies, supply chain disruptions, and global health crises. At events earlier this season, the series explored China's economic activity in the Arctic, countering PRC and Russian alliance wedge strategies. Today's discussion will examine the use of commercial unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, in combat during the ongoing war in Ukraine. CNA published a report in July that documented developments in the Russian and Ukrainian military over the first 4 months of the war and how commercial drones have emerged as a key combat multiplier. This session will build on that report with a discussion of recent developments and implications for both the ongoing and future conflicts. We're joined today by two of the report's authors, myself and Sam Bendett. We're also honored to have with us today CNA's Dr. Heather Roff and Faine Greenwood of Tarentum Consulting, LLC. Sam Bendett is, besides being a good friend of mine, is an advisor with CNA Strategy, Policy Plans and Program Center, SP3, where he is a member of the Russia Studies program. He is also an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security. His work involves research on Russian defense and technology developments, unmanned and autonomous military systems, and artificial intelligence, as well as the Russian military capabilities and decision-making during crises. Prior to joining CNA, Sam worked at the National Defense University on emerging and disruptive technologies for the Department of Defense in response to domestic and international crisis situations. Dr. Heather Roth is a senior research scientist in the Special Activities and Intelligence program at CNA. Her research interests include law, policy, and ethics of emerging military technologies, such as autonomous weapons, artificial intelligence, robotics, cybersecurity, and more recently, quantum, as well as international security and human rights protection. Before joining CNA, Heather conducted research with Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, DeepMind, and as a senior research fellow at University of Oxford Department of Politics and International Relations. She is author of Global Justice, Kant, and the Responsibility to Protect, was Routledge 2013, as well as numerous scholarly articles. Faine Greenwood is the owner of Tarentum Consulting, LLC, a specialty civilian UAS research consultancy, an expert on the use of UAVs in humanitarian aid who has been studying their use in the Ukraine conflict. Faine is also a research consultant for the University of Vermont as a part of the FAA's Alliance for Security Safety of UAS through research excellence and a senior spatial data scientist for the Massachusetts Department of Transportation's drone pilot program. Faine's research and consulting work in the drone industry focuses on how organizations can better incorporate drone-collected data into their decision-making process. This includes translating UAS data, such as multispectral and LiDAR imagery, into real-world systems and applications, in sectors ranging from transportation to environmental research to humanitarian aid. And so now we'll be moving on to, each panelist is going to give their remarks. And now what I'm realizing is that I have forgotten which one is going to go first. So I'm sure they know which one's going to go first. So I'm going to actually turn it over to the experts, because I'm sure that's who you're here to see. And so thank you for listening to the introduction. After they give their remarks, like I said, I'll ask a couple questions, and then we'll open up to your questions. Thanks so much. Next. Sam, you want to kick it off?
Thank you, Jeff.
Or yeah, Faine, whoever was set to go next. Go ahead.
I think it's Faine, then Sam, then me.
Great.
All right, well,
Awesome.
Let's get started. So I want to, can I share my screen? I think I can. All right, I'm going to set up screen share real quick. And in theory, that's working. Is the screen share working?
Yes, you got it. You got it good. It's good.
Awesome.
It's good thing.
Perfect. So I wanted to speak briefly about the concept of consumer drones versus military drones, which is a key to understanding what's going on in the Ukraine conflict. So I've studied consumer drone technology since 2013. I got started with getting a master's degree at Stanford University in journalism, and I actually became interested in how drones could be used for humanitarian aid, for journalism in conflict zones, and that's kind of led me into a career working on drone technology for civilian purposes and humanitarian aid, disaster response, and transportation and other applications. And I've been following this rise of consumer drones early 2013. And it's interesting that the Ukraine conflict has, really reignited in early 2022. Ukrainians are some of the first people to use drones really extensively in conflict, starting in 2014. So the slide here, for example, from 2014 to 2022, back in 2014, Ukrainians, who were some of the early people to adopt small drones, DIY drones as hobbyists, really became some of the first adopters of this technology for conflict use. They use it for reconnaissance, for targeting, for dropping explosives. So it's important to remember that Ukrainians have been innovating in the space from the beginning of the consumer drone boom itself. They've kind of been there from the beginning. So what they're doing in 2022 is built off a long history of leading in the space. And a bit about where consumer drones came from. So I've been working on the history of consumer drones for a pretty long time. And people often think that the consumer drones, like the DJI drones produced by Chinese companies, produced by DJI, which is the biggest drone maker in the world, it's a Chinese-based company. They often think that these drones are basically direct descendants of the Predator drone and kind of an evolutionary line. That's not really how it works. These drones are actually largely owe their roots back to the DIY hobby helicopter and airplane community that really started after the rise of radio control technology in World War II. And led to kind of this parallel hobby track for many years. So there were hobby helicopter. The hobby helicopter was basically invented and kind of refined in the 1970s. And fixed wing drones that are computerized or fitted out with cameras have existed also since the 60s and 70s. There's actually evidence of academic researchers back in the 1970s in the US and other countries using camera-mounted airplanes for things like forestry research and archaeology. So it goes back a little further than people might realize. And in terms of the difference between consumer drones and military drones, I think a key distinction here is that, one, these are drones that are intended to be used for consumer purposes. They're drones that were not built explicitly for military purposes. They're simply being adapted for that kind of application, similar to how one might adapt a mobile phone, Jeep, or another type of technology that is largely used by consumers but can be adapted for these purposes. Two, they're inexpensive. They're easy to obtain. You can buy them lots of places. It's easy to find them. That's been a huge aspect of their popularity in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. They're easy to obtain. And there's also a lot of And they're also easy to use. They require a minimal amount of training to get up to speed with them, especially with these popular consumer models. It's very easy to get people, it's very easy to train people to use them to do basic things like reconnaissance, and it's also very easy even to use them to drop small explosives. There's been a lot of innovation around building ways to drop explosive charges, often using 3D printed components with these small drones. And so the reason this is a distinctive thing that's happening in early 2022 is that we have seen small drones in conflict starting from approximately 2014, when I think as many of you are probably aware that consumer drones began to be adopted by ISIS and other groups in the Middle East and in that conflict, in Syria conflict. But this widespread use of drones in the Ukraine war is definitely novel. Again, they were used on a smaller basis in 2014 in the border conflict between Ukraine and Russia, but this widespread emergence in 2022 is novel. And it's also interesting that they're being used by both sides. So both the Ukrainians are adopting them, but the Russian military has also been using drones. Russian military forces have been using drones on an unofficial basis for since the conflict began. There was some initial, I think, there's some initial skepticism or confusion over if the Russian forces were actually using these DJI products due to, of course, many of the security concerns over DJI products. Again, they're produced by a Chinese company, but it ended up being the truth that some of the earlier reconnaissance Russian troops were using DJI Mavics. And as the war has gone on, I know, so Sam can speak to this too, there's been a lot more conversation, discussion about amongst Russian troops who want access to these small drones and have been getting them often via sense of volunteer networks. There's a lot of volunteer and crowdfunding efforts within Russia that are bringing drones to the front lines. They're often organized via Telegram. And these drones are, again, large numbers of these are also coming out and being disseminated across the border. There are now training camps. There's drone training conferences dedicated to using consumer drones. So they're a very key part of the conflict. And now, of course, the rise of consumer drones brings about a lot of other interesting questions about where they fit into conflict in the ways that have not been resolved yet. Humanitarian aid space, for example, which is where I do most of my work. There's been some confusion around where consumer drones fit, in the sense that it's not really well established where they fit in international humanitarian law. I've got a piece out for the ICRC I wrote back in March, building on some of my past research on consumer drones in its IHL context. And the central problem, really, without getting too far into the weeds, is that unlike manned aircraft or unlike more sophisticated large military drones, we really lack a good means of telling small drones apart in the air. We don't have an electronic way to do this. They're too small to be visually identified. So there's a lot of issues around telling apart who's using what. We do have some mechanism for saying that's a Russian aircraft, that's a Ukrainian aircraft. We have very few ways to do this with drones. And there have been a few use cases already in this Ukraine conflict where there has been confusion and has led some problems. So there's, for example, over the Irpin Bridge back in the start of the war, where civilians were attempting to cross, there were cases where there was a drone spotted on video, and it was unclear if that was being flown by Russians or Ukrainians. The Ukrainians were firing at it, but there have been other concerns. There have been other concerns over, and earlier that week or the day before, actually, a journalist been flying identical looking drones. It's been a persistent challenge. Journalists and combatants of both sides are using small drones in the same airspace. That creates a number of IHL problems. These are some of the novel issues that these drones bring about. Another issue, and then to close this off, is that these drones are being produced by DJI, despite obviously it's a Chinese company. There are security risks there. There's also interesting questions over how much control does a private company have over conflict. Well, DJI has decided not to no longer sell its drones directly in Ukraine and Russia. It does have aspects. The company does have access to other mechanisms of shutting down drones. They have geofencing capabilities. They have so far chosen not to use in Russia and Ukraine, but the company has a lot of control of these products. And there's, again, a lot of questions there for private industry control in this space. But and I think that's my overall. I do want to also briefly mention one of the main things I've been doing during this war is I've been maintaining a very large database of Ukraine war drone incidents. It's publicly available and anyone can see it, and I'll provide a link. But I've cataloged at this point up to 767 incidents where consumer drones are being used in the Ukraine war. My goal here is to turn this into research products, consolidate, and really create some research outputs around how the drones are being used in this war. But I'm hoping it's a useful resource for learning more about what drones are being used, where, what technologies, and the types of incidents. So thank you. And I think on to Sam.
Thank you very much, Faine, and thanks to the NSS for organizing this, and thanks for Jeff for leading this. Faine, if you can stop sharing your screen so I can share mine, that'd be great. Thanks so much. All right. Okay. I am going to share my screen, and I'm going to share several tabs that will aid in the visual discussion. And I think will give you a very good idea of what I'm trying to communicate with respect to the use of commercial drones in this war. I'm glad I'm following Faine because Faine and I actually share a lot of this information daily on Twitter. Both of us are looking at the open sources for the evidence of use of commercial drones by both sides in Ukraine. And one of the biggest sources of this information is actually Telegram. I think Telegram has emerged as a platform for very extensive data sharing for the a very extensive data sharing for this war. And there's just a lot of networks out there, a lot of Telegram channels that provide very detailed daily information of how quadricopters and commercial and civilian drones are actually utilized in this conflict. And so, as Faine mentioned, the use of these technologies goes back to the beginning of the Ukraine-Russia conflict in 2014, 2015. Ukrainians were the first to utilize commercial quadricopters against the overwhelming Russian advance, and the evolution of this technology continued sporadically throughout this war in its initial stage between 2015 and 2022. These technologies aren't necessarily limited to widespread use in Ukraine. In fact, evidence has emerged that commercial quadricopters were also used in the Nagorno-Karabakh war by both the Armenian and the Azeri soldiers. And Armenian and Azeri instructors, quadricopter instructors, traveled to Russia to learn how to use these drones for this war. And of course, quadricopters as combat aids and combat elements have been used in other conflicts dating back to 2011, 2012. But it really is in Ukraine that we're actually seeing this mass use and widespread use of these technologies by all sides. What's interesting here is that Ukraine has been the pioneer in using this technology initially for the defense of Kiev, because Ukrainian forces were preparing for a massive urban assault by the Russian military on Kiev in the opening weeks of the war. That assault thankfully did not materialize because of the Ukrainian defenses, but the Ukrainians were actually ready to use all technologies, all weapons to fight against the Russian invasion. And so, in fact, Ukrainian government put out a call for the drone operators to help fight in Kiev, and for drone owners to donate those drones to the Ukrainian forces. That has actually morphed into the army, the Ukrainian drone army that is actually. Let me see if I can pull this up. All right. It's actually emerged as a Ukrainian drone army, something that an effort that today collects private sector and commercial drones for the needs of the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian volunteers. I wasn't able to put out that tab, but I can do so shortly. So the Army of Drones is today one of the biggest ongoing efforts by the Ukrainian military to help them fight against the Russian forces. And so this is the website. You can go in, you can actually see the criteria, you can see what the Ukrainians are looking for, how you can donate the drones, and what you can actually do to help the Ukrainian effort. I think what has happened in this war with respect to the use of commercial technologies like quadricopters and how people can actually help is it has given the opportunity to practically anybody to donate to that aspect of the war that they find important via social media and especially Telegram. In fact, Russian networks and Russian channels, Telegram channels are raising funds on a daily basis for quadricopters so that they could be donated to the forces in the Donetsk, Lugansk, and the Russian military. In fact, volunteers can choose which specific quadricopter they want to donate to, how much money they can donate, and where that quadricopter is going to go. So this is, for example, one of the examples of Russian language Telegram channels of Warganzo, who is talking about what kind of quadricopters they already have and what kind of quadricopters they already need. Now, Russian volunteers are claiming that practically all commercial quadricopters flying today in service with the Russian military and the Russian forces have been donated by the volunteers. In fact, none of those have been actually put forth by the MOD. And that's very surprising because, as Jeff has mentioned early on, he and I wrote a report on the UAV use in Ukraine, and we actually cited evidence from the Russian Ministry of Defense that back in 2019, 2020, they were talking about mass-scale use of quadricopters, mass-scale acquisition of commercial quadricopters, and that actually has not happened. And so there are a lot of questions today about how exactly did the Russian military not actually equip their forces with technology that they've recognized years ago is absolutely essential to the fight today. And so right now, as I mentioned, volunteers can donate these quadricopters to the Russian forces. And in fact, there's been another very interesting post. 1 second, let me locate that. Okay, a very interesting post dating back to June by the same Telegram channel, Warganzo, that actually spelled out which specific quadricopters they do and do not need. And so today, volunteers can actually purchase very specific DJI Mavic drones, multiple types of models, to donate to the war effort. And this specific Telegram channel actually spelled out the quadricopters that they do not need as opposed to those that they do. And so, of course, DJI, because of their ubiquity, because of their widespread use, are used most of all by all sides, and especially by the Russian forces in the Donbass and the Russian military today. What began probably as a very organic way of equipping Russian soldiers with much needed technologies has now become an official policy. But what's interesting about that is early on in the war and many months into the war, and probably even today, Russian soldiers complain that they do not have a tactical edge on the battlefield. They actually cannot see a few kilometers out, few miles out in many parts of the front. And so in one of the very public outbursts, one of the Russian military soldiers was quoted by saying that they're kind of like blind kittens on the front, meaning they do not have the technologies that enable them to see and track Ukrainian forces very close to their own positions. And this is where these quadricopters come in. They actually fill very important roles, and these are 5 major roles: intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, to survey the adversary a few miles out. They perform combat missions because they can drop munitions right on top of the soldiers. They can track and acquire targets for the artillery and multiple launch rocket systems for both sides, and especially for the Russian military. And they are part of the larger information environment where videos from these quadricopters are widely shared on social media, on Twitter and on Telegram, and feed sort of into the larger combat military narratives by both sides. Finally, one of the missions for these quadricopters is psychological, because soldiers know that if they witness a quadricopter that's not theirs right above their heads, an attack will follow. And so this makes soldiers nervous, it keeps them on edge, and this kind of psychological pressure is also part of this larger war. The quadricopters today are so ubiquitous and are flying in such great numbers and are performing so many useful missions that one of the Russian military experts recognized it as one of the key elements of modern warfare. Former Russian General Baluyevsky actually said that the quadricopters, and this is the translated post, are absolutely essential to today's artillery missions. Quadricopters have elevated artillery to the level probably not seen since World War I, and these quadricopters are now the new face of modern warfare. What's important to recognize right now is that a lot of the soldiers who are operating these UAVs are also in danger. And so quadricopter usage and integration of commercial technologies into the larger military force is changing the way that tactics and procedures are conducted on the ground. And so I want to share with you an instructional manual disseminated amongst Russian forces, and a similar one exists in Ukrainian as well, which teaches commercial quadricopter operators how to conduct their operations. In other words, it spells out instructions that they must work in pairs. They must not choose the same landing and takeoff site. It actually spells out for them the distances and the heights that they must fly. It tells them how to operate and not operate electronics before and after the takeoff. And of course, this also means that there's a lot of people flying these quadricopters on the front that weren't necessarily part of military combat or training before. Apart from military pilots who are now fighting on both sides and flying DJI Mavics and other drones, there are also multiple volunteers. And these volunteers have to be integrated into the force. They have to be taught what it's like to fly the Mavic or any other quadricopter. So what has started on both sides of the conflict is that there are ad hoc and planned trainings and hackathons and training events which are taking place right now on both sides of the divide, where people can learn how to fly quadricopters, can learn how to operate them, and conduct combat training missions before they deploy to the front. And so Ukrainians conducted several such hackathons that brought together drone operators as well as military personnel to find better solutions for the front. The Russians have done it also on their side, and they actually conducted several events called Dronitsa, which took place early in September, which brought together volunteers and military to learn how to better operate their quadricopters in Ukraine. And one of the biggest missions for this event was actually to train the trainers. So it's not just enough to train UAV operators. There are significant UAV operator losses on both sides because both Russian and Ukrainian militaries are targeting these UAV operators as key assets in this war. There's now a need to train the trainers, meaning people who can train multiple UAV operators at once. And so this Russian Dronitsa event was actually that type of an event, which brought together a lot of people to actually go over the lessons learned, to share these lessons, and to attempt to train the drone operators for this conflict. One of the lessons after this Russian-led event was that these events are going to be held across Russia. They're not just going to be sort of annual, but they're going to be held on a regular basis to replenish the ranks of drone operators and other volunteers who want to donate and utilize this technology for the war. So going forward, I think going forward, this type of utilization of quadricopters is only going to increase. They have proven their ubiquity. They've proven their utility because of the simplicity, because of their cheap cost. They're relatively easy to replace, and because they're not really military-grade technologies that could be proofed against electronic warfare, there are significant quadricopter losses on the front. And so more of these technologies are going to be necessary, even if China officially stopped selling DJI drones, for example, in Ukraine and Russia a few months ago. There are plenty of these drones available in Eastern Europe, in Southeast Asia, on different types of electronic and physical marketplaces. So we're not going to see the end of the donations for the drones anytime soon. So this is an example. This is another Russian Telegram channel that actually talks about the acquisition of Mavic drones by the volunteers for the Donbass and Russian forces. Now that Russia has mobilized additional human resources, now that they're actually sending tens of thousands of forces to the front, they too will need additional intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability. They too will need to know what is happening just around the corner or just a few miles out. And so I think there will be a significant growth in the utilization of these quadricopters going forward. It isn't just DJI that is publicly available. Other companies like Autel are also publicly present in Ukraine on both sides of this conflict. So quadricopters have become very much an organic form of this war. They have become an organic part of this conflict, both for the Ukrainians and the Russians. And so the question is, how will the official military structures integrate these? So there's a lot of questions about Russian military's ability to officially integrate these quadricopters into the fighting force. There's a lot more hope for the Ukrainians, who have recognized the utility of this technology, and their Ministry of Defense is working very actively with the volunteers and the developers, those who fly and those who operate these quadricopters. I'll leave the rest for the Q&A session, but I look forward to your questions, and I look forward to your inquiries. Over to you, Jeff.
Great, thanks. I think Faine is up. I'm sorry, Dr. Roth is up next. Heather, you go ahead and take it.
No, thank you. Hold on. Oh, I'm good. I'm good. Thank you so much. So following on Sam's conversation about the use of commercial sector drones, and also Faine's really great conversation about the history of the use of drones, I'm gonna kind of come in on like the top side. And so what I would like to talk about is the fact that these types of weapons are not new, right? Like ever since there was a David and a Goliath, there has been a standoff weapon system. And so, the way that I think about it is these are just another kind of motion towards standoff weapons. And even actually the first use of the term killer robot was from the Second World War, when the V1s were used by the Germans, and they called them buzz bombs. And so we've seen a lot of this over the years. So what I want to say is, like, how do we put all of that historical operational knowledge into ConOps and ConEMs? And what I would say is that what Sam was saying is that the use of these things are changing the rapidity, like the rapidness of how fast we do ConOps and ConEMs. When it comes to the United States, for instance, we're really bad at doing agile ConOps and ConEM development. We're still working on the same model we have since 1945. And we have a very, what I would call an offense dominance. I'm sorry, I've been sick. We have an offense dominance posture going forward, to where we say, like, if we have more weapons, then we'll win. And I think what Sam's and Faine's discussions have showed is that you can get offense defense balance in different ways. In terms of where the US is going to potentially put all of their efforts, what we've seen, at least within the United States, caveat, in the United States, is that we understand that this stuff is coming. And so we've decided to put all of our eggs in the defense basket. And so we've done a lot of work on counter drone technology. We've looked at lasers and microwaves and eagles. There's so many things that we've looked at. But I think the way in which, as we move forward, as we're looking at the Ukraine war and how this is playing out, I do think that, at least in the US context, we were right to look at the defense side of the house, because if things do proliferate as they have been doing, you can't have a GoFundMe for a defensive drone technology, right? And so I think there's utility in looking at how industry and civilian technologies are merging with military technologies, but I don't think that there is going to be a utility looking at how you counteract against it, right? And so let me tell you a little bit about my work. So my work looking at human machine teaming, my work looking at autonomy in weapon systems. It is increasingly important that you, sorry, my daughter's daycare just called, sorry. I have to be a good mom. Oh, sorry. Sorry, hold on. But yes, so increasingly what you have to do is looking at, like, how you're going to employ those weapons at scale and for every single service, like every single service. So the Air Force has different needs than the Navy, for instance. And the Marine Corps has different needs than the Army. And so I think it's really important that we understand how you employ those in your concepts of operations. And right now we don't have a really good way of doing that. What we're doing is aside from the defensive, which is we're very good at thinking about the defensive, but we're not good at thinking about the offensive. So commercial drone technology is not, we can buy it. Yeah, we have the largest military budget like in the world. We can buy these things, but how do we use these things? And when we look at the United States and we look at the United States drone usage, like for instance, the Scan Eagle, right? So the Scan Eagle definitely has changed the way in which special operations forces have been able to see over walls, to do that ISR, to do all that things. But what we're looking at now is we are sorry, still dealing with my little person. Got it. So what we're doing right now, all right, go back to the Scan Eagle. So the Scan Eagle is been able to really extend the reach of our ground-based forces, our dismounted soldiers. And so when we put, soldiers in harm's way, we can actually extend our reach, we can extend our ISR, we can extend our situational awareness. And that's what we want, right? We want to do that. Where the United States is currently looking is increasing the autonomy. They don't want operators. They want the system to be able to do it themselves. And this is where we're having some trouble, because if you're the Air Force, it's fine, right? Like I can make a control model. I can code a control model that says, ground collision avoidance, right? All of these things, that looks great. But if I'm a dismounted soldier on the battlefield, say in Syria, and I've got to deal with rocks and crags and ditches and all these things, like that's not going to happen. And so I think let's put it this way, it hasn't happened in the last 40 years. Right now, the US Army started a dismounted vehicle tank, autonomous tank in 1983, and they still don't have one. So what I would say is that as we're thinking about where commercial technology is going, yes, we're going to get a boost from it, but we're not going to, in the defense sector, we have defense specific problems that industry is not going to solve, right? Tesla and Elon Musk is going to look for specific things that is going to up his bottom line, but it has nothing to do with defense, right? Because war is not fought on a 2-lane highway and you have a washout with your LiDAR, right? So there's different things that are happening there. And so, I think it's really important that we look at where industry is going, but I also think it's increasingly important that we remember that this is a defense-related problem. And, where am I going to send my tanks? That's a logistics question. Where am I going to send my tanks? How many people are going to be there at the Air Combat Command Center, right? And so even though you might have the ability to have 50,000 of these quadcopter drones in your area, it doesn't mean that you're going to effectively use them within your concepts of operations or your concepts of employment. And so I think it's really, really important to realize that at scale, I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing it integrated in the United States Defense Department. I'm not seeing it. The only thing we can do is, and what we have done, is defend against such a threat to our ships, to our FOBs, all of that. But in terms of real employment of how we're going to use it, we will not use it because they're also not they're not tested in such a way that we can trust them. There may be some backdoors, there may be all these different things. And we definitely won't trust the software on them for anything like mission critical. And I think that's the other thing is like understanding what like the concepts of operations and the concepts of employment and what mission critical really looks like. And if it's not mission critical, then sure, send them out. But if there is something even remotely mission critical, we will not rely on that. So I think it's really important to put those two things into focus, you know, like, yes, there's a huge push from Ukraine using these commercial technologies because their back is against the wall, and that's what they can do. Our back is not against the wall. And so I think looking at not just like exquisite weaponry, but like how we test, verify, acquire is very important. And acquisition in the United States military is very, very important. And how we do that is by ensuring that whatever we put on the ground is a safe, tested system. And a quadcopter with like a 3 kilogram charge is fine for once in a while, but it's not going to be proliferated through the force. And so I think we have to kind of put a little bit of, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but we have to put a little bit of a perspective on this in terms of, you know, like big military use of these things. And when I think big military, I think big Russia, I think big United States, right? Like there's only, and also one more thing, but there's also, you know, when you're thinking about, well, what if you had an autonomous ship? This is what I call this my evil genius hat. If you had an autonomous ship that could be a marsupial, right? So you could say there's things housed within something else, and then they just send them out. So you could have, say, I don't know, let's just pick on the orca because I like picking on the orca. So if I picked on the orca and the orca is above water, it has a 3-ton, I believe, 3-ton cargo bay. And so then you could say, well, I could fill quadcopters and scan eagles and anything else within that 3-ton bay, but they still have to come back and communicate. And right now what we're seeing is most of the things that are done are either very, very rudimentary in terms of control architecture, or it's completely controlled by humans. And so that still is a major draw on our forces, right? So if you really want high fidelity control, there's still a person behind it, which means we're kind of in the same boat that we were in, like, say, 1998, when we started using predators, and we're like, look at all the information, but it took 3 times the amount of labor to look through this data to understand what was happening. And so, you know, I would caution a bit of pause about how fast and how useful it will be in a concept of operations or a concept of employment. And that's what I got to say. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to the presenters. I'm going to kind of call an audible here. We realized that some of Sam's, some of the things Sam wanted to display didn't come up. And so I'm going to give a couple minutes to Sam rather than asking questions myself, and then turn it over. I'm going to start going through the questions from our audience, since we've got plenty of questions. So Sam, over to you for a couple minutes.
Thanks, Jeff, and I appreciate it. And apologies to everybody who tuned in who couldn't see my shared screen. I'm going to do this one more time. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see Ukraine assembling army of drones on the screen?
Yep.
Okay, so these are some of the facts that I wanted to go over as I was describing how both sides are using quadricopters. The Army of Drones is a Ukrainian volunteer effort. There's a website. You can donate money or you can donate a drone. There are specifications. There are specific requirements that you can donate to. There's an address. In other words, everything is on the record, and you can actually see what you're donating to, and you can make a choice. Another link that I wanted to share is this translated post by Wargonzo Telegram Network, which actually discussed specific types of Mavic drones that the Russian military needs and does not need. And so I included pictures and images of these drones here as I translated. This is on my Twitter page. This is a Telegram post, also from Wargonzo, which talks about the success in acquiring commercial quadricopters for the front. And he too is listing which specific quadricopters, which specific DJI Mavics are needed for the front and which are the ones that receive higher priority. I also mentioned that one of the former Russian military officials, General Baloyevsky, discussed the quadricopters in terms of absolutely revolutionary technology, and that this type of technology is revolutionizing how artillery, multiple launch rocket systems are used. He talked about how quadricopters are solving problems of reconnaissance and how they are basically elevating artillery to the efficiency of the precision-guided munitions. He basically talks about elevation of artillery to the World War I status because of the quadricopter technology, and quadricopters today are the new face of warfare. And I also mentioned an event that Russian military held in early September called Dronitsa. This is the logo. It was held for the first several days of September, which brought together volunteers and trainers and actual combat veterans who are flying these quadricopters in today's war. And so this was an event held outside of St. Petersburg region around Nizhny Novgorod to train the trainers and to train combat operators and to share lessons. And in a follow-up post about Dronitsa, Russians talked about how they actually want to make this a national event, how they want to hold it across the country because there are so many UAV operator losses, because UAV operators are so important for the military units, and they want to solve problems of integrating this commercial technology into the existing force structure. So again, I apologize that you couldn't see that when I discussed it, but I hope this kind of gives you a better visual. All of this information is public and it's on my Twitter feed. So with that, Jeff, thank you very much. I want to turn it back to you.
Great, thanks so much. I'm going to go to Susan. A question from Susan Connolly, who was actually has asked a question that I was going to ask you, Sam, right off the bat. At least in part, like how effective have drones been in giving the Ukrainian military an asymmetric advantage? And the second part of her question, which is what I was going to ask you, is like, to what extent did the Ukrainian use of commercial drones surprise the Russian military and you?
Well, I think they've been very effective. And both sides are now using these commercial technologies as part of their reconnaissance fire, reconnaissance strike contour, meaning it's a sensor which transmits information in real time back to the ground-based artillery or multiple launch rocket systems or mortar units that can strike target with accuracy. These drones can not just identify the targets, they can track the target in real time. This has been absolutely essential. I think I was prepared as an analyst of Russian military as we looked at the Russian invasion to see a lot more Russian military drones utilized in this conflict. The fact that the large number of quadricopters are donated by volunteers essentially is a bottom-up versus a top-down approach in acquiring this technology has been rather surprising. And we again raised that question in our report, whether this was violation of operational security and to what extent Russian military command decided to look the other way in order to actually gain better results. Ukrainians have done an incredible amount of work, and they have done an incredible job fundraising and publicizing the use of this technology to constantly put it out in the field. The Russian Telegram channels have to continuously remind the volunteers to continue raising funds and essentially send this technology to the front. So I think going forward, again, as I mentioned, because of the Russian mobilization, because this war will continue for months to come into the next year, I think going into this conflict, these technologies are going to be absolutely essential. They give that very important tactical edge to the soldiers in the front. And those soldiers who do not have that capability, who can't see a few miles out, who cannot have a good situational awareness, suffer very extreme consequences, such as not being able to identify Ukrainian forces massing for a Kharkiv counteroffensive.
Great, thanks, Sam. Heather, you said you had a question?
I do. Sorry, I'm still getting over a cold. So this is really for Sam. And I think hopefully it's not the only question, but it feels like there's a lot of piggybacking. There's a lot riding on communications networks. There's GPS, enabling things, right? So even if you have a drone operator who's flying that system, it still is kind of like admitting of a permissive environment. And I'm not certain that, you know, these technologies are working right now in Ukraine and Russia and Ukraine, and that's okay. But I'm not certain that a comms denied environment would permit the same type of strategic or tactical edge. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm actually going to answer part of the question and turn it over to Faine, because she and I were discussing that at length. A lot of Russian quadricopters and Ukrainian quadricopters are, of course, susceptible to electronic countermeasures, and a military-grade electronic warfare system can have a very significant effect. And in fact, that's why Ukrainians and Russians are commenting that they're losing a lot of these birds, and that they need more to, they essentially need to replace them in large numbers.
Just two fingers just on this. When we're talking about drones, this is the other thing I want to understand too, for clarification. If we're just focusing on like quadcopters and aerial systems, then it's excluding ground-based systems and naval systems, yes?
Right. So here we're discussing specifically aerial targets, aerial assets like the quadricopters that don't fly very high, don't fly very far. But there are ways for both sides to actually try to hide their equipment from each other's electronic warfare and each other's identification mechanisms, right, Faine?
Definitely. Yeah, and I think we've certainly seen some interesting examples of EW or electronic warfare being used against drones. I do think it has been, I think for a while now, there's been this, people have kind of assumed that consumer drone use of this conflict would eventually peter out or become much rarer due to the rise of more sophisticated electronic warfare tactics on both sides. That largely hasn't come to pass. I know it's certainly had an impact, but overall, consumer drones are still in the game. They're still being widely used. Certainly, in terms of the open source intelligence, of course, is all that we have access to. We regularly see incidences, such as one that was posted a couple of weeks ago by, I believe, Wargonzo, actually, on Telegram, a case where reporters were standing with Russian fighters who were flying a DJI Mavic. In the video, the Russian fighters note that the Ukrainians have taken control of the Mavic and they're going to imminently lose it. And they also say that we need to get out of the area because the Ukrainians are going to use the data that's on that drone, or they're going to use the drone information to effectively target where the Russian pilot of that drone had been standing. That was from a couple of weeks ago. There's examples of this being used effectively. I think I would say the thing that has been interesting is that, again, there were a lot of predictions. Have been predictions that consumer drones would again become largely irrelevant, and that's not come to pass, despite the fact that obviously there are EW tactics being used. They're still in the game, and there's constant innovation around drone hacks. There's constant innovation. I mean, a whole huge aspect of this is Aeroscope. So DJI has this proprietary drone detection system called Aeroscope that works with DJI drones. There's a lot of controversy early in the war when DJI was accused of hampering or limiting that system for Ukrainian forces. DJI denied the allegations, and I believe at this point it's still no proof that actually took place. Although there's still a lot of rumors going around, a lot of kind of chatter going around about Aeroscope. But Aeroscope's a relevant part of it. We know that both sides are still using Aeroscope. We also know there are effective hacks or measures that hackers have introduced again that are being used by both sides to make drones much harder to perceive or impossible to perceive by these Aeroscope systems, which again only work or primarily are intended to work with DJI products exclusively. That's one example again of a private company having an impact on the kind of warfare aspect of this conflict, which is the interesting, perhaps and somewhat novel aspect of this.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to the next question here from CW5 Ostrander, and I think Faine, you'd already looked at his question, but I'll read it. Based on research data being presented, are there any initial hints that Ukrainian utilized drones operating on GPS are more or less effective against Russia? Is data available for additional navigational aids for Ukraine besides GPS? If so, what type? That's to you, Faine.
Certainly. So I would say that in the current conflict, the majority of drone pilots that I've observed are using ATPI mode, or using a mode where you can fly the drone manually without GPS. Many of the manuals or guidelines that are circulating around both Russian and Ukrainian forces, which is an example of which that Sam showed his presentation, advise people to fly in this manual mode. So GPS is certainly relevant. However, a lot of people are again flying manual and skirting that. There also are, it's a complex topic because it's very dependent on the manufacturer, even individual model. For example, DJI makes a lot of different drone models and there are different limitations on each one. There's different hacks you need to utilize depending on the drone model. It's actually come out recently that the newest, the DJI Mini 3 that was released recently, won't even use the GLOSNASS system. It's believed that was probably in the works before this conflict. It takes longer than that to release a product, but DJI is actually moving towards video and Chinese systems and away from Russian systems. It's at least with this one latest product. It remains to be seen what happens with other products. So it's a complex topic, and I know that in your follow-up you said that, well, what is the maximum distance limitation? Again, unfortunately, the answer is it depends very much on the model of drone you're working with, the model of consumer drone you're working with, what mode you're flying, and the geographic characteristics of the area or distance can be hampered greatly by geographic factors, weather factors. There's a lot of aspects that go into this, so it's hard to make a single recommendation or have a single answer to that. But long story short, people are functioning in GPS in that environment, and there are ways to get around it.
Sorry, can I just like hop in on this? So totally agree with everything that Faine has said around, you know, all the different components that go into thinking about like the utility and the function of it. But in reality, it is a line of sight problem, right? So you know, either you have connectivity to the drone that's being fired, or you have a line of sight, which then minimizes how far you can get away from it. And so the utility of that, at least, and I'm not talking about, you know, I'm just talking about the quadcopter kind of thing. I'm not talking about undersea, underwater, because there's a whole bunch of other things that can happen in other domains, space-based systems. But like, but if you have to rely on a line of sight, then what you've done is you've also placed people in harm's way to control and to maneuver these systems. And sometimes, you know, yes, in the Ukrainian war, totally, like you can't get away from that. You can't get away from this is an urban warfare against urban warfare, and there are people there. But if you're trying to get like one step back, there is a line of sight problem and there is a connectivity problem. And that is something that from at least from a big military, not just like we're doing this with these commercial technologies, but from a big military perspective of how you can use it and how you can operationalize it within your concept of operations, within your concept of employment. You can't get around that because you don't know if that's going to actually happen. In fact, like the United States right now is actively trying to figure out ways to figure out how to control when you don't have connectivity, when you don't have communications. And so if these systems are reliant upon GPS or they're reliant upon open communications networks, then they're not going to have utility going forward. I mean, like, and in fact, that's one of the whole counter UAS arguments is that, you know, I can put an EMP on you and everything's done, right? So I feel like there needs to be just like a little bit of like a grain of salt while we're talking about this, because it might be conflict specific and we can see it, but I'm not thinking that it's going to be completely adopted and we have to change the way we fight through these uses. Over.
Oh, fair point. But I think, you know, for the point of understanding the dynamics for some of these smaller conflicts, like in Ukraine and others, I think it's important to note that, you know, a lot of the like you said, I wouldn't quite call it totally urban. It's a mix of urban, you know, suburban, and then just field fighting. A lot of the conflict is happening in very close proximity to each other throughout Ukraine. So I think I think both points are important. I think we need to be cautious about making statements that, you know, these small drones are going to be revolutionary given the kind of contested environment you're talking about. So I think that's a fair
right
point.
But it's still, I mean, it's from a military planning perspective, it's still an urban environment. I mean, Ukraine is an urban environment, even if there's fields, right? It's not like we're having a war on the high seas or in the Red Strait. Like it is an
Okay.
urban environment.
Well, we'll let that one pass. I mean, in my 25 years of Army experience, we don't call the entire, field of Ukraine urban, but we'll let that go. I'm going to go ahead and move on to another question at this point. This one, let me see. Let me go back. Right. This is from Elena. Where did I put her? There it is. So this might be for Sam and Faine. What difference will Iranian-made combat drones make in Russia's war effort against Ukraine, especially given the reports of numerous technical glitches in the Iranian drones?
Well, I think they can make a significant difference if used properly. We are already getting evidence from the ground that Iranian Shahed 136 loitering munition drone can penetrate Ukrainian airspace and can strike high-value targets. Russian military has made HIMARS, M777, and other long-range artillery that is employed by Ukrainians very high on their target list because of the success of these systems against Russian military forces. And so if Russian military gains the ability to strike these Ukrainian systems in depth, meaning far from the line of contact, with the help of these Iranian drones, then that can have an impact. Of course, even destroying a dozen or so systems may not necessarily change the face of conflict. But if the Iranian drones can fly as advertised, because a lot of the drones on the transfer to Moscow have long ranges in the many hundreds of kilometers, some over 1,000 kilometers, then Russians can strike Ukrainian logistics, command and control structure. They can strike civilian and military infrastructure and make it very difficult for Ukrainian forces to organize, mobilize, and move to the front or retreat if necessary. So this is probably where they can be more successful. But because some of these drones are already shut down, we're seeing evidence of Ukrainian military adapting to this threat and learning to identify and shoot down these Iranian drones.
Faine, did you have anything you want to follow up with on that?
Oh, no, that's pretty much covers the bases.
Okay. Again, another question. This one's from Brent Sadler. I'd be interested to hear thoughts from the panel on lessons learned from Armenia-Azerbaijan war regarding the use of drones. That was obviously, that in that conflict, the use of drones really got a lot of attention. So, Sam, that's probably another one for you. And I don't know if Faine or Heather, if you want to go in on that as well.
That's a great question. In fact, Russian military supposedly was studying this conflict very closely, given the fact that it took place right at their doorstep. And so Russians walked away from this conflict with the following thoughts. Number one, combat drones and loitering munitions are absolutely necessary, and they must be present in every conflict in very large numbers. And number two, counter-UAS, counter-UAV technologies, or any technology that can counter and negate the UAV threat and an advantage must be part of the military force structure. So it was surprising that when the Russian military invaded, when it invaded, and the way that it invaded, it actually didn't incorporate a lot of these technologies into their own concepts. Russia went into this war with a very small number of combat drones. They still have very small number of domestic drones, the Forepost R and the Orion. They have a small but growing number of loitering munitions that they are starting to use against the Ukrainian forces. That's the Kuba and the Lancet. But they're probably not present in quantities that could actually have a significant impact. And so these lessons from Nagorno-Karabakh, although very fresh, have not necessarily been incorporated into the Russian military for a number of reasons: structural, organizational, or even technical.
Just a quick two-finger on this. So one of the things about I think the commercial civilian merging, right, is that from a policy perspective, from a legal perspective, the Wassenaar agreements are crucial, right? And so who can send technology to another person, right? Or another entity, right? And so the Wassenaar agreements are agreements that specify this sensor, this power away, it's the swap thing, right? But the Wassenaar agreements have never been updated. And right now, at least from my accounting, I've at least had 4 or 5 different violations of Wassenaar just on open academic publications. And so, if that to me says that there is something from a legal policy regulatory perspective, there is something wrong, because companies can do whatever they want, right? And then they're not also giving anybody the full picture because of intellectual property laws. And so I think in this conversation, I think there's a serious, something's missing when it comes to, can we use commercial technology to fight wars? But maybe that technology is banned, but we don't even know if it's banned because no one's read Wassenaar. And also we don't even and I don't know, to me, there's just like a whole host of things that are missing here on terms of regulation, policy, and law. Over.
Okay, we have another question here. I think either this might be Sam or Faine, you've been logging a lot, the UAV use in Ukraine. Have we seen, this is from Charles, have we seen a use of micro UAVs such as Black Hornet? Do you envision a future where every squad or fire team will have a micro UAV?
So I haven't personally, I don't know that we've had the Black Hornet context. Perhaps Sam could speak to that and observe anything myself. But I would say that in the context of micro UAVs, I mean, in essence, the DJI Mavics in some ways, these are very small drones. They're super lightweight. They're foldable. Obviously, it's not in the particular military context. In the consumer context, they're already very small. I think the goal for a lot of these Ukrainian and Russian institutions, or fighters rather, is that pretty much is to have as many of them as possible, as many fighting groups as possible to have them. We're already kind of getting there with the sheer number of these in the field. And in fact, they're so inexpensive, they're replaceable, there's still fairly easy access to them. So it's interesting to see that and I think it's the cheapness aspect that really is relevant here. Again, you can buy these drones for $1,000, you can crowdsource for them. That's one of the problems, I think, with more sophisticated military intended small drones produced by, again, traditional arms manufacturers or traditional manufacturers who supply the military. They're simply so much more expensive, they're harder to obtain. Whereas again, you can buy these at camera stores, you can buy these at technology stores. That's a huge key part of this the advantage here with small drones. It's that price point aspect and availability. And also remember, you can also build these yourself if you have technological skill, and it's not a ton of technological skill. Aerorozvedka, one of the key Ukrainian drone fighting organizations that began as volunteers in 2014 and have played a very large part in this conflict. They custom build a lot of their stuff. They're not even relying upon, say, stuff like DJI. They are custom building using parts that are sourced from China, other manufacturers. They're 3D printing things. So even if the supply of DJI products, for example, was denied, they would figure something out. There would, of course, be no supply challenges, and that requires their skill. There's a lot of different complexities there around supply, small drones, but again, I would say the price points.
I want to double down on just what Faine said, because it's the ability to adapt quickly. That's the thing that I think is new here. The US system and the NATO allies and everybody else who belong to Wassenaar and all of our international regulatory regimes, the UN, different treaties, different legal regimes, they don't care. They don't care about those legal regimes, and they can reconfigure things so fast, and they can draw on civilian expertise to do that. And that, I think, that's what I think Sam was saying too, is like, you're drawing off of an expertise that previously you never would have listened to. And so the incorporation of civilian and military in this way is going to be increasingly problematic, because our militaries are so big and they're so stuck in their ways. And so when I see Russia actually embracing it, they're ahead of the curve, right? They're ahead of the curve. Over.
Let me just add a few things. I've actually seen somewhere in the news that Ukrainians will get micro UAVs from the West. I haven't seen evidence of that on social media yet or Telegram. But just to highlight and to underscore what both Faine and Heather have said, just because a military set is going to do something doesn't mean it's actually going to get there. And so I've given an example that in 2019 and 2020, Russian military was talking about mass acquisition of quadricopters for their forces because of the utility and the recognition of how useful they can be in conflict. And that obviously has not happened on the scale intended. So today, Russian military is actually planning on introducing micro UAVs Rostec made an announcement that's Russia's biggest defense industrial conglomerate, that they're developing this. Obviously, there's a lot of lessons learned and a lot of lessons from Ukraine, which are currently incorporated into the Russian military industrial complex plans and developments, but it doesn't mean that they're actually going to get them as planned or anytime soon. So large militaries have this way of sometimes slowing down processes, which are even good for them. And that's where the civilians come in. That's where the volunteers actually step in. And that's what has happened in Ukraine first, and then in Russia second, as the second phase of the conflict has began in 2022.
Great.
So I just,
Go ahead.
I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but like there's still a swap problem, right? And so there's a size, weight, and you're right, like there's a swap problem that is happening here. And so even though we're talking about micro drones, or we're talking about quadcopters with probably, they can maybe carry like a 3 kilogram charge, they're not going to do a lot of damage unless there's a ton of them happening, right? I mean, and I can foresee a future where a lot of them can obfuscate like air defense systems, but right now that's not the case. Right now, what the case is it's limited utility, and so unless you can solve the swap problem, micro drones and everything else, even the small quadcopters, they're not gonna solve like warheads on foreheads problems. I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but that's how I think.
I want to go to a question from Joe Butcher from the Swiss Center for Drones and Robotics. Interesting question. Drones certainly play an important role in conflict. However, a drone operator must communicate the information they receive from the drone. Beyond the small unit level, are drones only as good as the command and control system they are integrated into? What role do commercial technologies play in facilitating this? And I think everybody can answer that. I will say, thinking about command and control, Sam and I did a lot of work before the Ukraine crisis on Russian command and control systems, of which UAVs were certainly a central part. And when you think about the Soviet army was rather blind, right? If it grabbed onto you, it could fight pretty well and inflict a lot of damage, but it couldn't see very well. It didn't have very good battlefield awareness. And one of the things that I think has surprised us in the Ukraine conflict is that they had indicated they had done a lot of work since the Georgia war to try to build, like Sam and I wrote this article called "The Bear is Getting Glasses," for example, this understanding of battlefield awareness. And, these Russians call them, reconnaissance, strike and fire contours. It's a horrible translation, but it's basically a sensor to shooter kind of thing where you have UAVs and you have information in this unified information space, and you're able to actually, strike units in quick succession. And I'm just not seeing that. So I think it's an interesting question for you guys. I think we've kind of touched on this. Heather's touched on, all of you have touched on it, on this idea of operating in a contested environment. What are the limits of using UAVs that can only their line of sight to 400 meters? So talk about, if you can, like the role of UAVs in command and control and how effective, ineffective we've seen that in the context of the Ukraine war.
Let me jump in the beginning. I think what's important is to recognize that the commercial drones we're talking about, right? The short range drones that don't fly very high, don't fly very far, they provide the tactical edge. And even the Russians themselves are saying they need technologies that help them see around the house, beyond the forest, just down the street, maybe just a few miles out at the most. The fact that this technology is absent right now is a significant capability gap, and this gap has been recognized, made public for months, and it hasn't necessarily it hasn't been solved or hasn't been addressed to such an extent. There are a lot of sort of movements afoot right now amongst the Russian volunteer community based on the Dronitsa event and other events and other training centers that teach people how to fly UAVs, how to better integrate these small technologies into command and control, into existing military command and control, how to better share information, how to take information from multiple UAVs and integrate them into a single network that could be shared right away. That does not exist right now for the commercial drones. They exist very much in a piecemeal capacity, and on some parts of the front, they could be rather successful. On other parts of the front, they fall prey to the electronic warfare and counter UAS systems. So it's a good question, and Russians didn't necessarily solve that so far.
So 2 fingers on this, because I'm a political scientist. That's what I do. I like political science. But if we're going to use these technologies, to just push back on you, Sam, a little bit, and in no disrespect, but like, if we're using these in like proxy war battles, kind of like Soviet Russia, like in Afghanistan, 1975 kind of stuff, like if we're doing proxy wars, and what we saw Russia do in Syria, testing out its own tech in a battle that, it knew it was going to win. And so if we're doing that, then that's okay, right? I can get behind that idea. But when we're really talking about, are we getting the tactical edge? Are we getting the tactical information, to an air operations center, for instance, right? Like I'm still not seeing it. Like I still don't see how these types of systems are going to integrate into the larger planning effort that would go on, for instance, at an AOC. But on a proxy battle, sure, we can test it out. And however many civilians die, they die. We don't care. I mean, that's how Russia's been playing.
Well, look, here's what's important to recognize. The commercial quadricopter stepped in to fill the gap that was left by the absence of other ISR, short-range ISR drones that were supposed to be, for example, in the Russian military ranks in large numbers. And because a lot of them were lost in the beginning of the war or simply were not available, people had to switch to the available technology, something they could get their hands on, and DJI basically filled that gap. Had, for example, Russian military come into this war with many hundreds of ISR drones of different ranges that were integrated into a military network, which many of them are in fact integrated into such networks.
Right, but are they getting the DJI Inspire 2 or 3? Or are they getting the first version? Because the DJI 2 or 3 has more autonomous capabilities.
Well, they have multiple. They're getting multiple DJI drones. It's the 2 and the 3 and the Pro, and even the agricultural version that's also flying. I also want to give Faine a chance to weigh in because Faine knows the technical specs of a lot of these civilian drones as well.
Yeah, sure. So I would say that it's the Inspire, it's the Mavic. So the Inspire is a larger camera drone. It's the big white one. It's quite large. I actually have seen them quite rarely in this conflict, only a few times. I could even look at my database, probably pull it out, but they're pretty rare. The DJI Mavics, on the other hand, are extremely popular and common. They fold, they're lightweight. The newer, they've equipped with a pretty good zoom camera, and they're not very expensive. So the DJI Mavic 3 is the most recent model that is extremely widespread. DJI Mavic 2 is still being used widely, still very effective. Other things we're seeing is DJI Matrice, which is a professional drone that can be equipped with an XT2 zoom sensor. It's a really powerful optical zoom sensor. I've used it in my own work before. And they can also be equipped with thermal or FLIR sensors and for multispectral purposes. And again, these drones are sold to the commercial market for agriculture, for construction monitoring, for a lot of civilian purposes. They're being readapted. The DJI Matrice drones are much more expensive. So you're looking at $12,000, $15,000, $20,000, depending on what sensors you're putting on them for these. For those Matrice drones, whereas for the DJI Mavics, you're looking at $1,100. Now, information I would love to have, and I do not have access to right now, but I hope to find out in the future. I don't know exactly why people are trying to get the DJI Matrice to RTK. So RTK is a more sophisticated form of GPS. In essence, it's a way to correct your GPS signal and make it much more accurate than you get in the broad standard drone. So a standard drone uses GPS. Now, RTK is primarily used by map makers, and I used it again in my own work with drone mapping before. So RTK is meant to give you a really, really highly accurate orthomosaic map in the photogrammetry software process. I don't really understand what they're using RTK for in the context of the conflict. I would like to find out. Honestly, part of me wonders if it's simply, this is the most expensive drone, therefore it's what we want to get. I do wonder if there's a bit of that going on that happens in the drone industry pretty widely. I don't know if they're actually using their RTK feature in a meaningful way at this point, but we'll see. But yes, but I would say that again, vast majority of DJI products, there have been some Autel Evo 2, another consumer drone, but that's my vast majority of what we're seeing are DJI products. And small DJI products, primarily, small and expensive.
Can I just say, so I actually want to go back to the first question, which is about command and control, because I think this is that's the crux of the argument. It's really the crux of the argument. How do you incorporate all of the sensor data, all of the information coming from these systems into your command and control process? And then how do you effectively mitigate that? And that's where artificial intelligence comes in, right? You have to have some way of filtering all of this information and getting it to commanders to make appropriate decisions. And so, you know, when we're talking like, what if we did have DJI 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pros, whatever, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the information is coming to a commander someplace and they can effectively make a decision. And that's not just, you know, from an operational or tactical perspective, it's a legal question, right? Like a commander is legally obligated to take precautions before they take an attack. They have to know, but then you have epistemic problems. So this is where, sorry, my legal lawyer ethics hat comes on. How do you incorporate this civilian technology into a process that can be managed by people? It still is managed by people. So the more dispersed it gets, fine, but as long as the information is housed in one place, that there is a person who can see it, hence the command and control problem. And so I think that Jeff's question about command and control is like, it's really key here. We're finding it like, you know, I look at this as like we're throwing spaghetti at a wall and seeing what sticks. But at the end of the day, I still need to know before I go in and what I'm allowed, who I'm allowed to target, how I'm allowed to, how much weapons I'm allowed to put on that, what's my military objective, what's proportionality, what's distinction, what's necessity, like all of those things still matter.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. One of the things we're trying to come to terms with, you mentioned AI, is the Russians talked a lot about using AI to support decision making in the same, you know, and I just don't know that we're seeing that. I'm going to move on though, because we don't have much time, and there are a couple other questions I want to answer. One is by Aiden Ulu. I apologize if I mispronounced that. I'm going to answer this one. It's, while it's possible to fundraise for military drones and effectively use them against air defense, aren't we over-exaggerating the role of commercial drones in the Ukraine conflict? I think it brings up an important point about analysis of the Ukraine conflict, in that when we see new things, you will see a tendency for people to say, like, this is revolutionary, this is the thing that's doing it. And so I take your point. I think that it's possible. We have to be careful about over-exaggerating the use of something like UAVs or javelins or what have you as like the determinant of the outcome on the battlefield. All of these things work together in different ways. And as open source people, for the most part, you can really get a bias because there are certain systems that lend themselves to being put on, you know, TikTok or Telegram or Twitter that other systems aren't. I mean, there just aren't as many GoPros on top of guys running around just shooting in fields and urban environments as there are for UAVs. There's lots of really sexy UAV videos of UAVs dropping things into tanks and what have you. It's hard to tell if that tank is actually, you know, functional. Is that propaganda? So I think that's a fair point, that in all of this analysis of Ukraine, when we're looking at new things, we have to be very careful about drawing like fundamental, you know, bottom lines about what the future of warfare looks like, simply because we're just looking at Ukraine. So I'm going to close that question out. There's one I did want to go to on export controls, and I'm missing the person that asked for it. But I'm just going to ask for it. So there were, if I recall, the question is that there are a number of, even for drones that are used by some U.S. military units, there are commercial versions of these things. Are there, in the United States, are there export controls on some of these, and not just the small ones? We're talking about like larger drone use. Are there some export controls? I think, Heather, you might be able to speak to this one.
Yeah, there's a lot of export controls. It's not just on the size of the system. I mean, the size of the system is going to matter, right? And this is where I want to go back again to like other domains. It's not just aerial systems, right? It's like for instance, the Orca, right? The extra large UUV, right? That is a huge submarine that has a 3-ton payload capacity, just whatever you want to fill it with. But I think that because when we're talking about automated systems or autonomous systems, and we're only looking at a very small sector of that, there are export controls on the sensors. There's where the range can be, like if they can frequency hop, like we have those types of export controls. But the commercial sector right now, like they're not nearly military grade. And so that's why there are no expert controls, because they're not worried about, pumping something into a system that can, like, I don't know, quantum hop and like screw up your EMPs, right? Like we're not talking about those. And so we do have expert controls, but they're highly specific to frequencies. They're highly specific to sensors. They're highly specific to a variety of things, is what I would say. But we do have them, and Vassinar is one of them. The MTSR, MTBR, I can't remember right now. It's still like only 8 o'clock my time, but but there's a lot of them that we do have, but they also need to be updated. And they have not been updated in quite some time. And that was my point before, was, there are people who work in, academia who are like, oh, maybe I can do this. Oh, I managed to make that sensor smaller. And you violated Vassinar without even knowing that you needed to read Vassinar. That's the problem.
Great, thank you so much. For our final question, I'm gonna combine two questions, one from Aaron Marlowe and another one from Brent Sadler. Aaron asked what type of counter UAV systems are both sides using to negate the effects on the battlefield, but also, and Sam, maybe you've seen this, or Faine, you've seen this. What are you seeing as far as like things that operators do to avoid like counterfire? Like, are we seeing them operate drones and then quickly move, or are they operating drones on the move? If you've seen that, so if you could just kind of address counter UAV in the sense of both, systems that might, break links or what have you, and also, counterfire and stuff like that. Thanks.
Let me jump in, because this was the first screen that I shared with everyone, and let me just do that again. Let me see right here. You can see that, right? The images. So that's the actual image that I referred to at the beginning of the presentation. Faine and I discussed it, and we actually translated it as well. These are specific instructions for quadricopter operators on how to avoid being identified, how to better fly, how to avoid basically any follow-up fires once and if you have been identified. And the instructions are very clear. You must operate in pairs. You must change locations. Never launch and land the quadricopter in the same spot. It gives you instructions on what to do with your electronics while in flight, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll stop sharing right now. These instructions exist, again, for the Russians and for the Ukrainians. They've become rather ubiquitous. Russian military is using a range of electronic warfare systems, which are having an effect as recognized by the Ukrainians themselves on their quadricopters. And these are both stationary as well as hand-launched rifle-like counter-UAS systems. We haven't seen those counter-UAS systems, the handheld portable ones, on the very large scale in this war. And that probably raises a lot of questions about acquisition, technology, supply chains, and other issues. But that's probably coming down the pipeline, given the ubiquity of these drones overhead and given how much threat they present. Over to you, Faine.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with all you said. Again, we have not, there's definitely a lot of talk about anti-drone guns, for example. I think we have limited visibility what's actually being used in the field. I mean, there is a thriving network of hackers on both the Russian and Ukrainian side who are definitely feeding information to both. There's a lot of sophistication there. There's a lot of interesting efforts. But again, that's what we actually have to put eyes on with the open source resources that we do have. There's limited evidence of, especially the mobile systems being used. So, but it's something I think we're going to learn a lot more about what happened there at some point later in the future. But with the OSN capacity, is limited insight.
Sorry, just to be like, again, Debbie Downer. That's my job. I'm like the Debbie Downer wearing the Kant t-shirt. No, but like if you do have a large like commercial source, you have a vulnerability, right? Like you can get into that company, you can hack that company, you can hack that software. Where I think what the United States has done over a number of years is to try to make it so exquisite, right, that you can't hack it. And that's not working for them. But I think there is going to be, to Jeff's point about command and control, there's going to be a point, there's going to be an inflection point where we need to figure out like what's hackable, what's accessible, what's, affordable, all of these things together. And then what's our risk tolerance? And right now the risk tolerance conversation has not happened at all. So I would say it's all about risk tolerance. Over.
I should also note real quick that a key aspect here, right, is that these people produce the consumer drone manufacturers like DJI do not want to be the business making military drones. Their drones are being produced. They're trying to provide to civilians. They really don't want it. I'm sure they don't mind the extra profit, but that's not their business model. So, and they're definitely not. Sorry.
No, so I'm like, yeah, no, they don't mind the extra profit, which is another whole mode, right? I mean, like I've done some work with Microsoft over the years, and they're very, very considerate about who they sell what technology to. And they look at the government structures, they look at like, could it be retroactively hacked to like so I think these small drone companies really need to start thinking a little bit more globally than they are, because their stuff's already being used to do harm. And so, that's where the ethics stuff comes into play, which is that's where my boy comes into play. There's a little Kant here. there needs to be a little bit more ethics in it.
Yeah, I mean, DJI's been trying to play both sides of the field for a very long time. I think with DJI, but again, their perspective is they're never going to come out and publicly say we're providing to the military. So they're not producing their systems to that level. They want to produce. So I think that's a key thing to keep in mind. We're talking about consumer companies whose technology incidentally happens to be being used, but is not being used for, but it's not being produced for those purposes. That kind of produces other questions where, it's being used for something it is not built for. So of course it's not going to be sophisticated. Of course, it's going to have different circumstances.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it out, with our reference to the categorical imperative. That's a Kant reference for those of you that are out there. But with that, I want to thank all our panelists for sharing their expertise and insights with us today. I also want to thank all of you who joined us for today's seminar. For those of you who know CNA, welcome back. For new guests, who I hope, this is the first of many times you'll come to see these presentations. And I would also encourage you, some of the panelists, are heavy on social media. So if you have other questions or go to the site, you want to follow up, just let us know. Thanks so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.